What is the ultimate price of power? What dark line would a king cross? Not for wealth, not for land, but for something he believes is far more precious: eternity. Most rulers build their legacies on stone and steel, on laws and conquests. But history holds a much darker story. A story of a king who, in his quest to create a perfect dynasty, committed an act so profound, so unsettling, it shattered the very world he sought to preserve. This is the story of a kingdom at the height of its glory, and the horrifying secret that brought it all to ruin. This is the story of the king who married his own daughter. Imagine a kingdom bathed in gold and sunlight, the Empire of Lumina. Its spires pierced the clouds, its libraries held the knowledge of the known world, and its armies were the envy of all who knew their name. At the heart of this empire sat King Theron. He wasn't a tyrant born to the throne. He was a visionary. In his youth, he had inherited a fractured land, and through sheer will, brilliance, and a charisma that could charm a serpent, he had forged it into a monolithic power. The people didn't just respect him, they adored him. To them, he was more than a man. He was the architect of their prosperity, the guardian of their peace. He was Theron the Great, the Sun King. And the sun, it seemed, shone on everything he touched. Most of all, it shone on his daughter, the Princess Lyra. She was his only child, the sole heir to the luminous empire, and she was her father's daughter in every way that mattered. She had his sharp mind, his compassionate heart, and a beauty that poets stumbled over their words to describe. She was the jewel of the empire, and the bond between father and daughter was legendary. He taught her statecraft, philosophy, and the art of ruling. He wasn't just raising a daughter, he was forging a queen. The future of Lumina seemed bright, secure, and destined for even greater heights under her eventual rule. But time is the one enemy that no king can defeat.
As the years went by, silver threads began to appear in King Theron's hair. The man who had seemed immortal began to feel the weight of his own mortality. And with that feeling, a seed of fear began to sprout in the fertile ground of his mind, a fear that became an obsession. The problem was succession, the legacy, the bloodline. In the lore of Lumina, the royal family was not merely human. They were said to carry the sun's spark, a divine essence passed down through generations. This was the source of their right to rule, their wisdom, their power. It was everything. And King Theron became pathologically terrified of diluting it. Princess Lyra was beloved, yes, but she was a woman. To secure her throne, she would have to marry. And who could she marry? A prince from a foreign land? To Theron, this was unthinkable. It meant sharing his divine legacy, his life's work, with outsiders. It meant giving another kingdom a claim to his throne. A nobleman from his own court? He trusted none of them. He saw the ambition in their eyes, the hunger for the power he had built. Any son-in-law would be a potential usurper, a threat waiting to strike. The king spent countless sleepless nights pacing the cold stone floors of his palace, the weight of his dynasty pressing down on him. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whispered conversation. His fear began to warp his legendary wisdom into something else entirely, something cold and calculating. He began to consult the most ancient and forbidden texts in the royal library. He summoned mystics who spoke in riddles of purity and preservation. He spent hours with the high priests, debating obscure doctrines about the nature of the sun's spark. They all spoke of the same thing, the sanctity of the bloodline, the need to keep the divine essence pure, undiluted, and absolute. Slowly, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea so monstrous, so contrary to every law of nature and man that it should have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman. But Theron was not mad. He was a king pushed to the edge by his own obsession. He saw this idea not as a horror, but as a solution, the only solution. A sacrifice he and his daughter would have to make for the eternal glory of their dynasty. The court of Lumina, once a place of vibrant culture and intellectual debate, began to change. An unspoken tension crept into the air. The king became more distant, his eyes holding a new, unsettling intensity. He would watch his daughter, Princess Lyra, not with the warmth of a loving father, but with the calculating gaze of a strategist planning his final, most crucial move. And then, he made his decision. He didn't announce it to the world. It began with a private council meeting. Only his most loyal advisors and the high priest were summoned. The doors to the great hall were sealed. What was said in that room is lost to history, but the legend says that when the doors finally opened hours later, the men who emerged were as pale as ghosts. They had seen the abyss in their king's soul. King Theron, the architect of a golden age, declared his intention to preserve the divine bloodline, to create a perfect heir who would carry the unadulterated sun spark. There could be only one union. He would not give his daughter to any prince or nobleman. He would marry her himself. The silence that followed this declaration was said to have been so profound, you could hear the palace foundations groaning under the weight of the taboo. This wasn't just a breach of custom, it was a violation of the sacred order of the world. It was a king placing his own legacy above the gods, above nature itself. The high priest, a man who had been Theron's confidant for decades, allegedly argued against it, pleading with him to reconsider. But Theron's mind was set. He framed it as the ultimate act of royal duty, a terrible but necessary burden to ensure the empire's survival for 1,000 years. The high priest, faced with the choice of defying his absolute monarch or sanctioning the unthinkable, eventually bent. He found obscure passages in ancient religious scrolls that could be twisted to justify the act, presenting it to the public not as a horror, but as a holy mystery. And what of Princess Lyra, the vibrant, intelligent young woman destined to be queen? Her voice is silent in this part of the story. She was a pawn in her father's grand, horrifying game. We can only imagine her terror, her confusion, her heartbreak. The father who had been her teacher, her protector, her entire world, was now to become her husband. The love and admiration she had for him was twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. She became a ghost in her own life, her laughter replaced by a haunting silence. She was no longer the jewel of the empire. She was its sacrificial lamb. The wedding day was not a celebration. It was a spectacle of dread. The people of Lumina were ordered to celebrate, but their cheers were hollow, their smiles forced. They lined the streets as the royal procession passed, but they looked on with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The sky, usually a brilliant blue, was said to have been overcast with a strange gray pallor. The ceremony itself was a somber affair, heavy with incense and the weight of what was happening. King Theron stood tall, his face a mask of regal determination, believing he was securing his dynasty's future. Beside him, Princess Lyra, now his queen,
was a vision in white, but her eyes were empty. She moved and spoke as she was told, a beautiful automaton stripped of her soul. When the king placed the crown of the queen consort on his own daughter's head, a collective shudder ran through the great hall. The sun's spark had been preserved, but at the cost of the kingdom's heart.
The dynasty, from that moment on, was no longer built on glory. It was a dynasty built on horror. In the months that followed, a palpable darkness fell over Lumina. The vibrant energy of the capital city faded. People spoke in whispers. They no longer looked at the palace with pride, but with a kind of morbid curiosity, wondering what sort of darkness now resided within its walls. The love for King Theron curdled into a deep, silent fear. He was no longer their hero king. He was something else, something unnatural. Then, the news they were all dreading and expecting was announced. The new queen was with child. 9 months later, a son was born, a boy named Aurelian. He was the king's son, and he was also the king's grandson. He was the heir, the living embodiment of Theron's ambition. He was the perfect vessel for the pure bloodline, the guarantee of the dynasty's continuation. But he was also a symbol of its profound corruption. The birth of a prince should have been a joyous occasion, but in Lumina, it was met with a strange and fearful silence. The people looked upon this child not as a blessing, but as an omen. And it seemed they were right. The kingdom began to unravel. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, creeping decay. A blight took hold of the crops, leading to a famine in the outer provinces. A strange sickness, which the royal physicians could not identify, began to spread through the crowded city districts. The kingdom's borders, once unbreachable, were now harassed by barbarian tribes who seemed to sense a weakness at the empire's core. Theron, in his paranoia, saw these as tests from the gods, or conspiracies by his enemies. He tightened his grip, his rule becoming more autocratic, more brutal. The wise king was gone, replaced by a tyrant obsessed with protecting the son who was the product of his greatest sin. He executed nobles on the mere suspicion of treason. He imposed harsh taxes to fund a military that was suddenly losing battles it should have easily won. The foundations of the empire, which he had so painstakingly built, were cracking under the strain of his monstrous act.
The young prince, Aurelian, grew up in this toxic environment. He was raised in isolation, surrounded by fear and silence. He was told he was divine, perfect, the future of the empire. But he could feel the truth in the way people avoided his gaze, in the whispers that died whenever he entered a room. He was the heir to a throne built on a secret that everyone knew, but no one dared to speak. He inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's melancholy. He grew up to be a cold, detached, and deeply troubled young man, haunted by the unnatural circumstances of his own birth. His mother, Lyra, remained a tragic figure. She performed her duties as queen with a hollow grace, but the light in her eyes had been extinguished on her wedding day. She faded from public life, a beautiful, sad specter in the gilded cage her father had built for her. Some say she died young, of a broken heart. Others say she simply withered away, a flower denied the sun. Years passed. King Theron grew old, his body failing, but his paranoia burning as fiercely as ever. He died not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, but in his bed, consumed by fear and madness, still believing he had done what was necessary.
And so, Prince Aurelian, the son and grandson, became king. He inherited an empire that was a shadow of its former self. The treasury was empty, the people were resentful and superstitious, the army was demoralized, the spirit of Lumina was broken. Aurelian ruled as best he could, but the curse of his origin clung to him. He was intelligent, but he trusted no one. He was powerful,
but he was utterly alone. He was the pure-blooded king of a dying kingdom. The end came swiftly. The internal rot had weakened the empire so much that it could no longer withstand the pressures from the outside. Rival kingdoms, seeing their chance, invaded. Rebellions, simmering for a generation, erupted across the provinces. The great armies of Lumina, once invincible, were shattered. King Aurelian, the last of the Sun Kings, was said to have met his end in the throne room of the Grand Palace as enemy soldiers smashed through the gates. He died defending a legacy that had been poisoned from its inception.
The great Empire of Lumina fell. Its magnificent cities were sacked, its libraries were burned, and its people were scattered. The grand experiment of King Theron, his obsessive quest for a perfect eternal dynasty, had led to its complete and utter destruction. He had crossed a sacred line to preserve his bloodline, and in doing so, he had ensured it would end in fire and ruin. The story became a cautionary tale, a whispered legend told by the survivors and their descendants for centuries to come. A reminder of what can happen when the pursuit of power leads a ruler to believe he is above the laws of nature itself. A lesson that some lines are drawn for a reason. For in the end, a dynasty built on horror can only beget ruins. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more untold history.